In Minnesota, the trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin for the killing of George Floyd continues. Both sides have now rested their cases and are expected to deliver their closing arguments starting on Monday. And last weekend, 20-year-old Daunte Wright was shot by Officer Kim Potter during a traffic stop in Minnesota. Potter has since resigned and has been charged with second-degree manslaughter. Here's what Vice President Kamala Harris said on Tuesday about Wright's death.
Our nation needs justice and healing, and law enforcement must be held to the highest standards of accountability. At the same time, we know that folks will keep dying if we don't fully address racial injustice and inequities in our country, from implicit bias to broken systems.
Wesley, you've been reporting on this issue since Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. So what do the events in Minnesota tell us about the relationship between Black Americans and the police in 2021?
Well, first of all, I think that what we've been reminded of is how this is an ongoing issue, even when we're not paying attention, right? That during the Chauvin trial, there was a high-profile shooting in Minneapolis. I think it can be easy for us to forget sometimes when there is not a case that folks are focused on, that according to the Washington Post's Fatal Force Project, 3 people are shot and killed by the police each day. And so this is an issue that's playing out in the heartland, even when Washington's not focused on it. It's going to be remarkable to see what happens in the case of this trial. It was a fascinating trial, talking to attorneys and experts, both who've defended officers as well as who've prosecuted them. They've really thought this has been a unique and fascinating legal proceeding just in terms of how these cases are tried. There's a big question mark of, is the populace at a place where it's willing to convict a police officer, which is typically and historically very difficult? And even if that officer is convicted, what happens? Is he given a lengthy sentence or is he given a short sentence? Because often, again, police officers don't necessarily receive the same sentence as you or I were we to be convicted of the same crime. But what I do think it shows is that these are still issues that are top of mind for many Americans, and specifically for many of the Americans who are part of the Joe Biden coalition that helped him get elected. We have to remember that we're having this conversation at a time where Joe Biden has still not been able to get through 2 of his major nominees to the Department of Justice to handle these types of issues, where there has not been major action from the administration, at least not yet, on issues of policing and criminal justice reform. And so this is something that, we know that the Biden strategy has largely been to try to pass big, sweeping legislation on things that are broadly popular, infrastructure, COVID relief. But what is happening here is the news calendar is forcing a more divisive issue, one where Biden and his base, or Biden knows he's going to have to service his base at some point, his base really cares about it, forcing it up in the calendar. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens next week and what response might come out of Washington.
And, when you talk about that news calendar that's very crowded, a lot of different dates that seem to be taken up, Eugene, you hear Vice President Harris talk about racial injustice this week, but what Black Americans want to see is action. And so what action can the Biden administration take? What action will it take? And how high on the agenda, how close in the calendar is action when it comes to race and policing for this administration?
Yeah, one thing that's been frustrating as reporters when you're trying to ask this administration about certain things that they may not be focused on right at that moment, they are laser focused and stay laser focused on what they want to talk about, right? You've been in those briefing rooms where when they want to talk about infrastructure, that's what they want to talk about. When they want to talk about the COVID relief bill, that's what they want to focus on. But since the transition, the Biden team has pointed to kind of these 4 different crises that they see: the pandemic, the recession caused by that pandemic, climate change, and then these issues of systemic racism and equity in the country. So for them, they say that it's high on the list. Like Wesley was saying, whether or not it gets up there is going to be the amount of attention that it gets. but there isn't much that the White House can do unilaterally, right? It's things like using the bully pulpit that we've seen both the president and the vice president there use multiple times this week, unfortunately, from both of them. And then there's the Justice Department, which today scrapped a Trump policy that would essentially stopped the use of consent decrees to tackle and try and fix police misconduct. So they're trying to do things. The Biden administration has pointed out that they're kind of behind the ball, mostly because of there was almost no movement in this space when it comes to the DOJ using its investigatory power on racist behavior by police officers in this country. But advocates and activists want more. The more that we're going to see this happen for Black and Brown people, this week has been really hard and really heavy. You talked about the Daunte Wright case happening so close to Derek Chauvin's trial, the video of Adam Toledo being released. And so people of color are feeling this. And so the Biden administration is going to start feeling a lot more pressure. Congress is going to start feeling a lot more pressure. And this is a space where Biden, because of who his base is, because of who put him in the White House, Black people, he's going to have to do more than they're seeing right now.
And then some would argue, Kasie, that Congress needs to do more too. I mean, this is not a new issue for Congress, and there was big talk on the Hill months ago about possible negotiations between Democrats who have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act and Republicans who back this proposal by Tim Scott of South Carolina. Where do those talks stand, if anywhere?
Well, Nancy, you and I both covered that at the time. It was a very emotional and difficult period for the country, and certainly Capitol Hill was no exception to that. But the challenge, I think, is that even then, control of Congress was split at the time, and Republicans said that the Democratic bill went way too far. Democrats said, you know what, yours doesn't go nearly far enough. And ultimately, there was a stalemate. I think there were some Republicans like Utah Senator Mitt Romney who wanted to negotiate around this issue in good faith. He was, I know, personally disappointed by how those negotiations played out. But the politics of this, I think, make it very, very difficult to move forward, especially, quite frankly, with Democrats controlling both chambers now. We again go back to this idea that without 60 votes in the Senate, it becomes almost impossible to do anything. So if that filibuster rule remains in place, that would mean that 10 Republicans would have to side with Democrats and say, yes, this is something that we want to do. And given how highly charged it is politically, given how this is likely to become a very highly charged emotional issue in the midterm election campaign in swing states and districts, I have a very hard time seeing how there is any ultimately bipartisan agreement to move something forward on this. It's just so fraught. Now, of course, events could change this. I mean, the verdict in this trial, I think, could be a potentially very pivotal moment in our country, depending on what, as Wesley was just talking about, what the verdict is and how, whether or not there is a perception that justice has been done in the case of George Floyd. So I would hold that out there as something that could potentially change the course of this, but it's still extraordinarily difficult.
So difficult. We only have a couple of minutes left. So, Anne, before we go, I would like to get an update from you on the J&J vaccine and where things stand. At the start of the week, Dr. Anthony Fauci said he thought the pause would only last a few days. Well, it's been a few days. So what's happening now?
Yeah, Nancy, the work week ended without an announcement from the FDA and the CDC that the pause would be lifted or changed in any way. This is really a disappointment to a lot of healthcare professionals who were relying on the J&J vaccine. It's very uncertain ground at the moment. The J&J vaccine was really designed and intended to be used to fill an important part of the vaccine landscape. As you say, it's one shot. It also doesn't need to be hyper refrigerated, which makes it ideal for use in all kinds of places and among all kinds of populations that very much need that kind of flexibility and finality. One shot and you're done. And the administration has not yet said, and it will be very difficult to for them to figure out how to do something else if the J&J vaccine is completely unavailable.
Right.